This essay example, as well as thousands of others, is available in text format on our website for free and without registration. Simply Google Ivy Panda Free Essays.
Issue number 1. Parental stress and mental health. Identification of the issue. Poverty is when one lacks adequate resources to meet all essential human needs. Families living in poverty are unable to save some money for investment or emergency purposes. In essence, impoverished families spend at least 75% of their income on food, shelter, and clothing. Parental stress and mental health have a causal link with poverty. With the tightened budget, parents of families living in poverty struggle to make ends meet, and in the course of their struggles, they experience many stresses and depression. The toughened struggles lead to irritability in the parenting role as a whole, and this causes the entire family to experience some mental distress. Financial stresses increase the parents' emotional distress, and the parents cannot respond sensitively to the children's needs. Parents end up being harsh, inconsistent, and non-responsive. With the living as mentioned above conditions, the children's mental health is affected. The children live in denial. They relate poorly with their peers from elite families and perform poorly in school. Rational interventions. As evident, the impoverished families are from the minority ethnic communities. These families need family strengthening interventions and family support services. It is noteworthy that these services are available, however, they are not readily accessible to most of the families living in poverty. An intervention to make the services readily available and accessible would help in addressing the issue. The service providers can offer the services in venues that the target audience can readily access. Moreover, time is an essential aspect for impoverished families. Since most parents spend the entire day doing manual jobs to earn a living, the family support services would work perfectly if scheduled during the evenings. Moreover, most of the families living in poverty are those from minority ethnic groups, and thus, they suffer from an inferiority complex. Therefore, the family support service providers ought to be resilient. They may receive several setbacks from the target audience, but they ought to find ways to win the trust of the members of the families living in poverty. They should find a way to overcome the prejudice regarding members with mental disabilities and those with difficulties in learning. The most important lesson that the members of the families living in poverty should learn is the coping strategies. The parents should learn how to respond to their children and thus improve their relationship with the children despite the toughened economic conditions. The parents ought to learn several skills: efficient conflict resolution skills, child-centered parenting skills, efficient budgetary skills, enhanced emotional functioning skills, and the principles of developing healthy relationships. On the other hand, the children ought to learn how to remain resilient despite the massive poverty-related stresses. The family strengthening interventions should help parents and children living in poverty to learn how to develop safe and healthy relationships in spite of the adverse effects of poverty. Cost and benefits of the proposed interventions. The above-named interventions would cost the government quite a large amount of money. Further, the involved service providers will have to work extra hard to make sure they attain their goals. They may have to work extra hours to convince the parents to adhere to certain aspects. The service providers may experience several setbacks from their target audience, and thus, they have to be resilient throughout the exercise. However, the benefits associated outweigh the costs. If the parents and the children living in poverty adhere to the teachings, the parental stresses, economic stresses, and emotional stresses that lead to mental health issues would decrease drastically. Issue number 2: Food insecurity and hunger. Identification of the issue. Food is a basic need for human survival. However, the fact that not all families can afford quality and quantity food is very distressing. Food and nutrition determine the health status of an individual. However, Families living in poverty do not access the right amount of food to replenish the body's nutrition requirements. Therefore, members of families living in poverty suffer from malnutrition. Poverty, food insecurity, and hunger are somewhat related. Children of families living in poverty are prone to nutrition inadequacy ailments. In America, there are minority ethnic communities that suffer from food insecurity and hunger. Insecure and non-lucrative jobs are the core causes of extreme poverty levels. America is a first-class nation, and one would not expect to find families suffering from adverse poverty, food insecurity, and hunger. However, the tragedy affects millions of American citizens, where the unnecessary health conditions associated with child hunger burden the taxpayer. It is very embarrassing that America has children who suffer from growth and developmental impairments because of food insecurity and hunger. It is also worth noting that food insecurity and hunger lead to deterred emotional, cognitive, and intellectual development, which affects the educational performance of the affected children. Rational interventions. Food insecurity and hunger is a problem that directly or indirectly affects the entire nation. The pediatricians, in collaboration with the Ministry of Health, should take the role of vaccinating all children against childhood hunger medical conditions. In addition to vaccinations, pediatricians should treat children in an effective and efficient manner whenever they have any health condition associated with hunger and malnutrition. It is noteworthy that food insecurity and hunger are community problems, and businesses have to come in and show their social corporate responsibility, CSR. Business leaders have an obligation to help in financing and enabling the success of the interventions to eradicate food insecurity and hunger. Nutrition assistance programs, food assistance programs, programs to invest in the poor, food aid programs, agricultural programs, and programs to prevent humanitarian crises would help in eradicating food insecurity and hunger. It is the role of the federal government, the non-federal government, and the businesses to fund the above-mentioned programs to eliminate food insecurity and hunger. Cost and benefits of the proposed interventions. Obviously, the government will incur extra costs in addressing the issue of food insecurity and hunger because not all business owners will be willing to fund the programs. In addition, the pediatricians and the Ministry of Public Health will have to go the extra mile to reach the hidden patients who suffer from malnutrition. However, this worthwhile exercise would greatly help the children. The approach would solve all the problems associated with the physical, emotional, and intellectual development of the children living in poverty. The children would perform highly in schools and thus enhance their future lives like the children from elite families. In addition to the associated benefits to the members of families living in poverty, the exercise would save the taxpayers from the burden of financing the hospitalization of sickened, hungry children. The employers will benefit from reduced absenteeism because of child sickness and improved employee turnover at the workplace. Finally, the government would benefit from a practical and competitive workforce of healthy citizens. Did you like this Social Issues of Families in Poverty sample? To get more works like this one, make sure to check out the free database of academic paper examples at ivpanda.com. You will find thousands of samples for all your study needs, without even having to register.